Hello.
Okay, so thank you all for coming. So first, a little introduction. So my name is Dana Douglas. This is my colleague, Tristan Wilson. We are both UX specialists at UserWorks, a UX consulting company in Silver Spring, Maryland. And so as part of our job designing and evaluating user experiences, we're always thinking about whether those experiences are accessible to as many users as possible. So just accessibility to us is, it means that all users, regardless of their ability, are able to use whatever product we're working on. And they're able to do the same tasks that are intended on the site.
Okay, so we wanted to give a little bit of context about how this presentation came to be. I'll try to hold this in front of my face, sorry.
Is that on?
Is it?
Can you
Can
hear?
you guys hear me? Is it a little
Okay.
louder? So first off, we want to emphasize that we're not developers. We're user experience specialists, possibly accessibility specialists, but we don't claim to be developers. We just work with them pretty often. We also love developers. However, sometimes we feel like that isn't a mutual feeling. They don't feel the same way about us. It sort of feels like some days, or some people think that our average day goes a little something like this. So first thing is wake up in the morning. Second, ruin everyone's fun. And then third, give developers a whole lot more work to do. And that kind of makes us sad. We really believe in accessibility. It's really important to us, and it just bums us out when it gets a bad rap. So we want to use this presentation as a way to maybe convince at least some of you that accessibility doesn't have to be a dirty word.
Okay, so obviously accessibility can go far beyond the internet, but this evening we're going to focus on web accessibility. So the tips, the techniques, the tools that we're going to be talking about are for making websites accessible to all users, including and especially those users with any kind of disability. So first, let's talk about the disabilities that may be affecting some of the users who are visiting our websites. There are four main categories of disabilities, and we're going to go through each one of these briefly. So first, vision impairments, and this is probably the one that most people think of when you're thinking of web accessibility. But vision impairments can include more than just blindness. So it can include color blindness or any kind of less than perfect vision. Now, how do people with vision impairments actually access websites? Well, users with lots of different disabilities will make use of tools called assistive technologies, sometimes referred to as AT, so you may hear us refer to them as AT. But those assistive technologies help them access the information and also navigate a website. So some of the assistive technology tools that people with visual impairments will use are screen readers, and those will read the screen and also allow blind people or people with vision impairments to navigate the screen. There are magnification tools, which will magnify the text on the screen. There are Braille displays, which will translate the text on the screen into Braille. There are also high contrast tools, which will change how the screen looks, and so it can put it into high contrast mode. And then there are some users may use large print or tactile keyboards to navigate a website.
Okay, so next up is auditory impairments. And so obviously this includes things like total hearing loss, but we're also talking about partial hearing loss or just any not so perfect level of hearing. So some of the most common assistive technologies used for auditory impairments are captions and subtitles for media. That can be audio or video. Sign language accompaniments also for media. So you may have seen somewhere a little box in the bottom corner of a video that you were watching and somebody is signing along and then a deaf person is watching that and sort of getting the context of what's going on from that. And so the third one we have here is full transcriptions of that audio or video media. And that's usually used more after the fact than during. So it's essentially like the captions, but in a single document that everybody can read all at once.
Okay, so the third category would be motor impairments, and this can include a wide array of impairments. So it can include tremors, full paralysis, limited reach, or just loss of fine motor control. And so users with these types of impairments may access the web also using different kinds of assistive technologies. So first of all, keyboard. The standard keyboard can be a really useful tool for someone who has trouble using a mouse, or who has trouble controlling a mouse or a trackpad. So, and even if they're not interacting directly with a keyboard, a lot of assistive technologies are keyboard driven. So they kind of take different input and give commands to the keyboard, and that's how they navigate the site. So they kind of rely on the keyboard. So for example, the second one here, speech recognition tools. So that will take someone's voice commands, and it will basically, so I could say tab and it would kind of do the same thing as pressing tab on a keyboard. So also head and eye trackers and mouth sticks and head wands are other ways that people with any kind of motor impairment might navigate a website.
So finally, we've got cognitive impairments. So that includes things like dyslexia, memory loss, intellectual disability, or neuropsychological deficits. So things like attention disorders and stuff like that. So some of the most common assistive technologies that are used for cognitive impairments are memory aids, so any sort of tool that helps someone remember something that they need to remember. The accommodation software, so things like text readers or note takers. And then organizational tools. So anything that, any piece of technology that helps somebody organize themselves or what.
Okay, so now all of these impairments that we've just discussed can fall into one of two additional categories, permanent or temporary. So permanent impairments are long-term. They can last the majority or the entirety of a person's life. Additionally, as some people age, they tend to develop some of these permanent impairments. So these types of impairments are probably what most people think of when you think of disabilities. However, there are also these temporary impairments. So these can include maybe a temporary injury or simply any impairments due to a circumstance or a situation. So for example, extremely low lighting or very bright lighting can give you a vision impairment in that situation. Or same with a loud environment, you can have a hearing impairment then. So really anyone can have a disability at some point or another. Okay, so hopefully we've driven home the point that when we talk about web accessibility, we're not just talking about screen readers and we're not just talking about blind people. So next we're going to talk about some of the arguments against accessibility that seem to exist. And we're hopefully going to convince you that they're not very strong arguments. But before we get into those, we will first mention that yes, of course, sometimes you are actually legally required to have to make your site accessible. If your site is a federal government site, it needs to be compliant with Section 508 guidelines. But since no one really enjoys doing something you have to do, tonight we want to focus on some of the other motivations for implementing accessibility. Because we want everyone to make their sites accessible, not just the people that have to.
Okay, so argument number one that we hear from those developers that don't like us so much, or because we make this up in our heads, it isn't worth the trouble. It's such a small amount of users, it's a small audience. It's not worth me putting my time and effort in to do all this work to make my site accessible if it's only going to impact a few people. So maybe we already debunked this one in the last few slides, but we're going to try to give some more evidence against it here. So let's talk about who actually benefits from accessibility. The obvious answer, of course, is people with permanent disabilities. So it's not as small of a group as you might think. The US Census Bureau reports that 19% of Americans are living with some type of disability. And then when you move up to Americans that are 65 and older, that number goes all the way up to 50% or more. So that's a lot of people. But even if it wasn't, even if it was 1% of people that had disabilities, you all know what I'm going to say. Put yourself in their shoes. Even if it's a small number of people, isn't it worth it to let those people have the same access that everybody else has?
Okay, so other than the people with permanent disabilities, remember we talked about those temporary impairments. So one example would be high contrast text. So this is an example of an accessible feature, I suppose, that helps users with permanent vision impairments to be able to read text on the screen. But it also helps any user who's outside on a sunny day trying to read their mobile phone screen. So that high contrast text is going to help them as well. Just another example is captions. So this allows users with permanent hearing impairments to access audio information. But it also allows users in a loud or a very quiet environment to be able to access that information, that audio information without sound.
Okay, who benefits from accessibility? Well, everyone else too. So the first and really simple example, it has to do with tables and simple tables. So obviously having simple tables is way easier for blind people who are using assistive technologies, or anyone with a disability who's using an assistive technology to navigate through, just because it's an organized structure and it's easier for them to find the data that they need to. But the same goes for people who don't have disabilities. If you have a really complex table on your site, it's going to give everybody trouble, not just the person who's disabled. So in that way, accessibility can be good for everyone. So here we're talking about keyboard access for elements on a site. So obviously someone who's using assistive technology that relies on the keyboard needs to be able to navigate the site with the keyboard. Usually they're hitting the tab button and it's shifting the focus from interactive element to interactive element. And that's obviously essential for those people, but it's also helpful for people like myself who think that tabbing through a really long form or something is way better than using the mouse to try to click around to each form field as you go. So in some ways like that, it offers conveniences for people who don't have disabilities. And the last one is labels that are associated with their form fields programmatically. So in the label element, you have the for attribute and you assign it to a certain input that the label would correspond to. And that's really helpful for people who use assistive technologies, because when they tab into the input field, for example, the screen reader will announce the label automatically, so they know exactly where they are and exactly what the input is for. So that can also be helpful for people without disabilities, because it increases the size of the interactive space with some inputs. So the most common example would be checkboxes. If you programmatically associate an input, a label with a checkbox input, you make the target area that much bigger. So, excuse me, if you've ever used your phone to tap on a checkbox or something, and you accidentally tapped on the label, and then it still worked, that's a label that's programmatically associated with the checkbox. So it's kind of helpful. So to reiterate the argument, it isn't just worth it for people with disabilities, and we hope we've sort of convinced some of you of that.
Okay, so moving on to another anti-accessibility argument. So it's too expensive and it's too much work. So basically this argument says, okay, we understand we should do it, but we just don't have money in the budget for all that extra work that it's going to take to make this website accessible. So this is probably one of the most common arguments, but we're going to try to prove it wrong. And while we're at it, another common argument is, oops, it's going to ruin the design. I can't do anything cool if I want it to be accessible. So we hear people say, I have to use ugly colors, or I won't be able to do that cool map that I was envisioning, or those expanding panels that I wanted to add on the page. So again, we're going to try to prove this argument wrong. We're going to tackle these last two arguments together because their solutions also often go hand in hand.
Okay, so a few solutions. I think that almost every developer in the crowd here is going to know what we're talking about in the next few slides. People who aren't developers might even know what we're talking about, but we think that we might be able to offer some details about these things that relate to accessibility that you might not have known, or might connect the dots for you and make it a little more obvious. So the first one we want to talk about is ARIA. So it's WAI, ARIA, that's the full acronym, and it's Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. So ARIA is a technical specification published by W3C. It contains guidelines on how to increase the accessibility of websites. Web applications is how they word it. It allows developers to add role, property, and state information to elements on the page. And it helps assistive technologies to parse non-standard markups that an assistive technology might not recognize when it comes to purpose. So ARIA provides accessibility features that aren't yet possible with HTML alone. So HTML5, and we'll get to this a little later, is trying to adopt some of these features. But ARIA is just so much more robust. There's so many more options that you have with it. HTML just can't do it, and HTML5 can't do it yet. And oh yeah, we sometimes think of ARIA as an accessibility band-aid, and that's sort of an oversimplification. But I think the analogy still stands. Oftentimes ARIA is used as sort of like a patchwork solution. You throw it on at the end, you develop a whole site, you realize, oh, it's not accessible, we're in trouble. You start throwing ARIA into all the elements, and it does a pretty good job most of the time. It'll make the site a little more accessible. And we don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, but that's why we think of it as the band-aid sometimes. But it's also used at the beginning of the development process, and it can be really helpful if you start including it early on. And we think that's the best way to do it.
Can I go?
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay. So we wanted to go through a few examples here of ARIA. So the first one we want to talk about is landmark roles. This will relate to something else in HTML5 that we'll talk about a little later. But it's basically a way of adding an attribute to sets of HTML elements to tell assistive technologies what section on the page it's referring to. So for example, the banner section, if it was just a div, a regular general HTML element, you could throw in the role equals banner attribute, and that would tell assistive technologies as soon as they come to it what they're looking at. I'm looking at a banner. Same goes for footer, main content, section. There's all sorts of these landmark roles that will help assistive technologies know where they are. And so,
oh, you got more?
That's right.
Okay.
Just an example of one.
Okay, so another example of some useful ARIA attribute is ARIA expanded. And so these can be used on those expanded panels that maybe, those expandable panels that maybe you thought you couldn't use. So basically it will indicate that this region is expandable, and it will indicate the present state, whether it's expanded or whether it's collapsed. So we have a code example down here, but actually we have a little video example of this in action with the screen reader.
But you can see in this first section here, ARIA expanded false, so that's representing a panel that's currently closed. You would click on this button, and then this panel would open up, and then that'll change to ARIA expanded true until the screen reader that's open.
Okay. So, okay, so before I go through the video, so this is a video of the JAWS screen reader interacting with two different expandable panels. So one without any ARIA and one with ARIA. So let me just go through the code. So as Tristan was pointing out, so this one is just a regular link, but then over here it's the exact same code, but we've added this ARIA expanded equals false to indicate that it is currently collapsed. And for those of you who have never heard a screen reader, what you're going to hear is it's a funny voice reading the page elements as we navigate to them. And you typically use the tab key or the arrow key. So every time you press the tab key, it's going to say tab, so you'll hear that. And then the difference you're going to hear between the two examples here is that in the first, we'll just be told that there's a link. We won't be told that it's expandable or whether it's collapsed or expanded. And then in the second example, we're going to hear that current state, that it's currently collapsed.
And you will hear in the first one, eventually, after she taps forward a little bit, JAWS is getting to the point where it's good enough that it sort of guesses what's going on. And after she tabs into the element the first time, it will say expanded. But obviously, it doesn't have the ARIA on it. So just ignore that.
Tab. Example title heading level 3 same page link.
Okay, so I'll translate in case you didn't understand it. It said tab, example title, so it's reading the name of the link here basically, and it says same page link. So as far as I know, it's just a link, and maybe it's going to jump me down to the bottom of the page, so I don't know anything else about it. So I know I can activate it because it's a link, so if I hit enter, oh, it didn't work.
PowerPoint doesn't handle video as well. Who would have guessed?
All right.
Tab. Example title heading level 3 same page link. Enter. Expanded.
Oh, is it tab?
All right, let's do this again.
Tab. Example title heading level 3 same page link. Enter. Expanded.
No, I can't go back.
Enter. Collapsed.
Okay, so then when I hit enter, then it says collapse. So that's what Tristan was saying, that fortunately, though it doesn't make as good of as an example, but the assistive technology, so JAWS in the browser, I think this is IE, I don't remember. So they are getting better. So they have figured out, so now they do say expanded and collapsed, but I still didn't know the initial state when I first got there. So when we hear this example, we are going to hear that initial state.
Tab. Example title heading level 3 same page link collapsed. Enter. Expanded. Shift tab. Example title heading level 3 same page link expanded. Enter. Collapsed.
Okay, so as you saw when it was expanded, so I just kind of shift tab and then tab back into it. So that time it said the same thing, same page link, but at that time it said expanded because that was the current state. So as you can imagine, this can be very useful to a screen reader user to know whether the panel is expandable, whether that content is expandable, and then obviously knowing whether that's currently expanded or collapsed. So without that knowledge, they could actually miss that information.
Okay, so a couple more examples here. The first being ARIA labels. I think this one's really handy. It's basically a way of providing an assistive technology only label. So only an assistive technology is going to see this. It's not visual. It's not going to impact your design. But you add this and you can sort of add a custom label to any element you want and tell assistive technology, screen reader, whatever you want it to. So my favorite example of this is if you have a link that's going to take a user to an external web page or open up a new tab or window, you can add an ARIA label to it that says this is going to open up a new window. You know, don't be surprised when you click this. And that's really helpful for people who are blind, especially because it can be really disconcerting to open up a new window and then you have no idea where you are because the focus will automatically shift into that new window. So you just give them a little warning with this. And then the ARIA role equals alert. So the alert role is a good way of prioritizing important information, error messages, for example, that would pop up. So say you're going down to the bottom of a page, you go through a form or something, you hit submit, and then an error message shows up at the top of the page. Someone who's a keyboard only user would have no idea that it's there if focus doesn't automatically shift back up to it. They're at the bottom of the page. So they would either have to tab all the way back up or decide to hit back a bunch of times. But when you use this alert role, you can throw it on any element, and as soon as it appears, it'll call the screen reader's attention, it'll call the assistive technology and tell it, this is important, this is an alert, bring focus here and read it. So we have an example of that.
Okay, so on this one, as Tristan was saying, so basically we're just going to tab through, say this is a form, just we have a couple text inputs, and then when we click the submit button, this alert is going to come up at the top in red, and the screen reader is immediately going to read it.
So it's just firing a JavaScript, like a really simple thing. When you hit submit, and then it'll just show up. There's nothing. But the important thing is the thing that's showing up is this P element with the ARIA alert role.
Example form with error message heading level 2. Tab. Example input edit. Type a tab. Example input B edit.
So again, it's
Type
just
in
saying
text.
tab.
Tab. Example input C edit. Type in text. Tab. Example input D edit. Type in text.
And it's
Tab.
the
Submit
label.
button. Alert. This is an error message with the role quote alert quote.
Okay, so again, it was just reading the label and it was telling you it's a text input and you can type in the text. And then as you saw, as soon as we click submit, the focus was immediately brought here. And so this is great for error messages, which can be a real issue for people with assistive technologies, missing those error messages.
Success messages too. We've seen a lot of people not bring focus to success messages.
Okay.
Okay, so now moving on to HTML5. We will probably start breezing through this because we're running out of time. So you've all probably heard of HTML, HTML5. HTML5 isn't perfect accessibility-wise, but it's the most accessible markup language ever. And I can say that with confidence because W3C actually created an accessibility task force specifically for HTML5, and they're constantly working on making it more accessible, coming up with new ideas and writing documentation. So HTML5 has built-in accessibility features that make developing accessible content easier than it's ever been. You've got things like improved semantics and sectioning. I'm going to go through each of these in the next slides. More granular form construction, native validation and error handling, and better support for media and media alternatives natively.
Okay, so one example of a new feature in HTML5 is the introduction of sectioning elements. So these are the header, footer, nav, aside, main, section, so those elements. And so these are used to label those major sections of a typical web page. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it's a lot like we just talked about ARIA landmarks. So basically what these sectioning elements do is they essentially force the specific ARIA landmark and those same features of the ARIA landmark onto these sectioning elements. So where before you could give an ARIA landmark of banner for the banner at the top, it does the same thing as giving a header element or using a header element. So again, this makes it more convenient to authors to communicate the structure of the web page.
And one thing I'm realizing that we didn't put on the page that we should probably mention is that this is dependent on browser compatibility.
Mm-hmm.
So if HTML5 isn't supported, this stuff probably isn't going to work, and you should revert back to ARIA.
Okay, so in this example, we'll go through this pretty quickly, but we're just going to tab through the different sections. So this is using HTML5. As you can see, it's using header, main, section, and footer. So we're going to tab through the different sections. Two things you're going to hear. When it goes to header, it's going to say banner. And when it goes to footer, it's going to say content info. And so those are the ARIA landmarks. So they just want to make it a little more confusing, but it's used interchangeably. All right.
Tab, banner. Tab, empty main region.
So it's a banner, empty main region.
Tab, empty content information.
And empty content information.
You can probably guess that she was tabbing to those because we put them in the tab order just for this demonstration.
Right, yeah. Okay.
Okay, one other thing that we wanted to touch on is input restrictions. There are a few new ones with HTML5. So it gives you a little more control over common input restrictions that a developer might have when the user is filling out a form. So most obvious one is required. That's now part of HTML5. We've got the pattern attribute and the max and min. So I'm only going to go over required for time reasons, but basically you just add this attribute. If the field needs to be filled out before the user hits submit, it's going to force them to do so. And it also, when they tab into the field, the assistive technology will announce to them that it's required. So they'll have some idea they need to do it before they hit submit and get an error message and go back and all of that stuff. So let's see. Mention that. Yeah, we'll move on. We got a video.
Okay, so this video is demonstrating the required attribute. So here we have a name with an asterisk, so that usually means it's required, but that's basically just a visual indication. A lot of times we have seen it's not included in the label as it is here. So right here, the label is just name, then the asterisk is outside the label. So a screen reader is only going to hear name, so they're not going to know it's required. Except with HTML, you can add this required attribute, and you'll hear that the screen reader it's going to announce the label. It's going to announce what type of input field it is, and it's going to say that it's required.
And you'll notice we say Chrome down at the bottom, but we switched this out at the last minute. It's Internet Explorer because Chrome was being weird with JAWS.
Without HTML5 heading level 2. Tab, name edit, type in text.
So it says name, edit,
Tab,
type in
submit button.
text.
With HTML5 heading level 2. Tab, name edit required, type in text. Tab, submit button.
Okay, so it said name, edit, required, type in text. So as you can imagine, this is going to reduce a lot of errors for assistive technology or screen reader in particular users.
And something I think is really cool, and it's not totally fleshed out yet, but if you were to hit submit on that, we've got nothing running in the background, just the HTML. Since it's blank and it's required, now that the required is natively in HTML5, the browser is going to pop up an error message that says you haven't filled out this form. So it basically has native validation handling. Unfortunately, it doesn't work really well with screen readers yet. It'll bring the focus back to the input field, but focus isn't shifted to the message. So blind people obviously can't see it and they won't hear it. So it's not, it doesn't totally work yet.
Yeah, so you still have to use your own error message in order for the screen reader to see it, but
One day.
yes.
Okay, so very quickly, input types, it's another set of attributes, and this allows you to set exactly, and these sort of existed before, but there's more of them now. It allows you to set exactly what type of input you want. So instead of just saying type equals text for a text box, now you can say type equals tel for telephone, email, date, URL, et cetera, et cetera. And these come with their own sorts of validation handling. And ideally, they would announce themselves to the screen reader or assistive technology when you tap into it, but that's another thing that's not fully supported yet. It sort of works for the date type, but we've noticed an inconsistency. And then error handling, we mentioned that.
Okay, and so one other example is that with HTML5, you can now use programmatic captions. And so what this will do is it will group your images or figures with the caption. So it makes it absolutely clear which caption goes with which figure. And just a little example here. So for example, here's, we have an image here and it has a caption underneath it. So visually, we can pretty much tell that this goes with this image. But a screen reader user may not be able to get that context. So what you're going to hear is it's going to announce the image in the alt text here, and then it will read the caption, which is basically just plain text right underneath.
And really funny.
And then with HTML5, so now we're using this figure element and a fig caption. So what this is going to do is it's going to say start group or group start, I think. And it'll actually read the caption first, and then it will read the image. So it makes it very clear that they go together. All right.
Without HTML5 heading level 2. Graphic NoVA logo. Lang. The logo for NoVA, the oddest place to be on the Wednesday night. With HTML5 heading level 2. Group start.
So it's a group start.
The logo for NoVA, the oddest place to be on the Wednesday night.
Reads the caption.
Graphic NoVA logo.
And then
Group end.
And then it says group end at the end.
So now you know you can call NoVA NoVA.
Yeah. Ox, yeah. And so another thing is we could have multiple images, and so you could group all the images together and have one caption. So you can do that with the figure element as well.
Okay, so global attributes. Tab index allows you to set any element into the tab order. And now in HTML5, you can throw that on anything you want. Sort of the opposite with hidden, but also hidden makes it entirely invisible. And you can throw that on any element you want now in HTML5. I'm sorry, we're breezing through these so quickly. And then native media handling. So instead of having to use Flash and Java and things like that, now you can just have HTML5 video tag and throw like an MP4 in there. And then it's kind of cool because you can also add a track element and throw in subtitles and stuff. So you can make your media a lot more accessible by including subtitles natively in the browser. All right, so to sum up, in general, using HTML5 alone, using it according to the standards, is a great start for accessibility. However, there are still some compatibility problems, as we mentioned before, and that's both for the browsers and for some assistive technologies that haven't adopted these things yet. So ARIA goes above and beyond what HTML is currently capable of, as it should, since it's a lot older. But if you want to be sure that you're doing the most you can, we recommend using ARIA and HTML5. ARIA is probably more complete, but you know, if you're doing things in a standard way, you can probably get away with HTML5 and be pretty accessible.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about frameworks and libraries, because one of the easier way to build an accessible website is to let everyone else do all the hard work and just use some accessible examples. So a lot of modern web development libraries and frameworks now include accessibility features. So these resources are going to help you. It's going to make it a lot less of a chore to make your site accessible. Now, we will give you a caveat that none of them are perfect and they're not magically going to make your site accessible, but they can really get you started in the right direction.
Okay, so everybody's favorite, Bootstrap, is a popular front-end framework, released in 2011. It's free and open source. It contains HTML and CSS templates with some optional JavaScript if you want. And they claim, and we've verified for the most part, that almost all of their templates and snippets are accessible, unless you modify them, then you're on your own. But it provides you with a lot to work with out of the box. Foundation, it's pretty similar. It's also free and open source. And they flat out state that all components and examples are screen reader and keyboard accessible. We haven't tested that one as thoroughly as we have Bootstrap, just because it's less common. But from what we've looked at, it looks pretty good as well. So great, good. US Web Design Standards, we're going to go with awesome for this one because, can we?
Oh, sorry.
Again, awesome for this one because it's a library of UI components and styles developed by the government. So they ensure that every asset offered is designed to meet Section 508 accessibility standards. So you're pretty much guaranteed that if you snag some stuff from their toolkit, that it's going to be accessible. It also looks pretty good. Turret, I think this is the weakest of the four. They describe themselves as a style and browser behavior normalization framework. Their HTML templates are largely written accessibly, and they include like a couple of lines of CSS that basically just allow you to say, hide this for everybody except the screen reader. That's about the extent of it. So yeah, some assorted libraries and plugins for anyone who's into accessibility JavaScript. So ally.js makes things a little bit easier automatically. Bootstrap accessibility plugin, you can just sort of throw that into your Bootstrap framework, and it's going to make things a little more accessible. It was also developed by the PayPal team, interestingly enough. And then Accessify, Accessify HTML5.js. So that's a JavaScript plugin that mitigates browser incompatibility. That's stuff we were talking about before. And it'll automatically insert those ARIA roles into all the elements of HTML5, so you sort of got both, and you don't have to worry about the compatibility issue. And I won't go through each of these, but you've got like a color contrast generator to make sure that you're getting a color palette that meets contrast standards, some things that help you highlight and check your own site, tools for generating accessible things, and then a very exhaustive list from W3C of other accessibility tools and checkers.
Okay, so those are a lot of tools and that you can use to make your site accessible, but talk a little bit about some strategies that you can use. And these will help make accessibility more affordable, make it easier, maybe make it more fun. So the first is to implement accessibility as early as possible. So start thinking about the elements that you want to include on your site and how you're going to make that accessible. And that helps avoid those post hoc remediation costs, which can be a lot more than if you had just started including accessibility at the beginning. Another thing is to just simplify and standardize your page elements. So use some of those tools that we talked about, some of the frameworks and the libraries. Use standard HTML elements, simple layouts. And if you do all that, then you're pretty far in having an accessible website, especially if you use them consistently as well. So that just makes it more accessible and more usable. And finally, we recommend just being creative and open-minded when you're coming up with accessible solutions. So if you find something on your site that's not accessible, you don't have to go back to the drawing board. So what we like to do is we start with the goal. So our goal is, the user really needs to know this information at this time. So maybe it's an error message or something. And then think about some different possible solutions. And really often the simplest solution is the best one. So just a couple examples. So we had a client who was using this cool map, and it had little pins in it that if you mouse over, it had information there. And then they had a table of all the search results, the same results. But the thing was, they didn't have all of the information in the table that was in the little rollover. So they were having trouble getting the mouse over and the pins and the map to be accessible. When we said, really, if you just had that information in the table, you have the same information in two different ways. And so that's completely accessible.
People get obsessed with trying to make this weird thing that they made super accessible when really it's perfectly okay to just take the same information and present it accessibly elsewhere on the site or elsewhere on the page.
There was another project that we were working on where they had a panel on the right side of the screen that would update to say it might turn red. It was like a customer service type thing, so saying how many people were waiting. And so they were trying to figure out, it would auto update. They were trying to figure out how to make that accessible. So what we did is we gave them a couple different solutions. We said, okay, well, instead of auto updating, just put a refresh button so people can just go over and press refresh, and then they know when to check, and they can check and see whether anything has changed. Or we suggested considering this ARIA live equals polite. And so what that does is it will alert screen reader users of changes to an element, but only when they're idle. So it's very polite. So there are kinds of different ways that you can approach different problems. So in conclusion, so we hope that we've convinced you that accessibility isn't such a dirty word, but it can actually be quite the opposite. So hopefully you agree that it's worth the investment, and it's hopefully kind of a minimal investment anyway, that it's actually pretty easy to implement if you use some of the tools we talked about. It can actually work seamlessly with your existing design, so you don't have to go back to the drawing board. And sometimes maybe it can be kind of cool, maybe. We think so. All right, and so thank you very much for having us, and we can definitely answer any questions if anybody has any.
That's what we look like.
Yeah.
Everybody's asleep.
Yes.
So I find it incredible that you're still having people raise up that this is not only good but not hard and cheaper if you do this just about everything else. How often are you finding, and maybe this is that you have to do this, or people say no, we don't do that, or kind of anecdotally, or have data of how much you have to do this, not necessarily do this presentation.
Right. So a lot of our clients are federal government clients, and so they are in that camp that have to do this. And so for them, the struggle more is kind of like we're trying to do today, like trying to give the impression that it's not so bad. Just, it's like we don't have to make your life harder. We can actually use some pretty easy solutions to make things better. So that's kind of more what we have to do. I don't know, you have anything?
Yeah, we see a lot of the time, we'll get these third-party developers that give their product to a bunch of different people, and then all of a sudden they end up selling it to the government, and then the government says, whoa, this isn't accessible at all, and it's the law. And they decide, okay, we got to make this accessible, and they run to us, and they say, how can we make this accessible? You've got this government standard that we need you to look at and compare it to our tool. I find that the really difficult thing for us seems to be there are a bunch of different levels of accessibility standards. You may already know this. And a lot of the clients will want like AA, where there's also like AAA and single A. And we find issues that aren't as severe. But if the law doesn't tell these clients that they have to do this, we can barely convince them to change things.
Yeah, and I think our issue is that, so we're from a consulting firm, so we're not usually there when they're designing the product at the very beginning. So we come in at the end. So all of you guys who are actually with the product designers or product designers yourself, so you guys can really help by spreading the word and kind of getting accessibility baked in at the beginning. I think that'll help. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, how does the government force or check?
They hire people like us. So yeah, so usually a client will come to us and say, hey, we need to make this accessible. Though I will say, we've worked with the state of Massachusetts a lot, and what they do is the people who are providing the software have to ensure that it's accessible. So they may hire us and we can help them make it accessible. Or then the state also will hire someone else like us who will check to see if it's accessible. So they kind of check it in two different ways. So that's at least how Massachusetts does it.
We have seen people using like automated checkers. You just feed everything into it and it spits out a really long list of everything that could be wrong.
True, yeah.
Obviously, we're going to say that we don't want to be replaced by machines, and that's not the best way to do it. But we really do find issues with the way that it spits out the results that aren't necessarily inaccessible. So sometimes it's worse than it really is. So there's a bunch of different ways.
Yeah.
This comes up. Sometimes it also comes up with like it's like internationalization, because there are things that you don't think about to the end. I won't think about that later. And it's really expensive. Whereas if you, I think that what your point about saying starting early is so important, so that it doesn't have this gigantic price tag
Right.
at the end, which is why I think a lot of people like it. But now, because now it's going to take us 5 months to record.
Right.
Yeah, really, like with this presentation, we wanted to sort of give little tricks that you can bake into your design process really early on. Just throw this ARIA attribute on everything. Sort of like almost you could add it to a style guide, like do this every single time as you go. And then you won't have to come to us and pay us to fix it.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was gonna add on to that. I don't work with everyone now, but when I used to, like the VA was the last contract on, the VA office has their own Section 508 office that I would work with, and they're the ones. Usually each agency has their own
Right.
Section 508 office if you're that type.
Yes, that's true. That's a very good point. Yeah. Mhm.
Also, I think HHS may have been for a while in charge of going through and checking various .govs.
Mhm.
They did have up a chart of how those government agencies fared with their
Right.
tests,
Mhm.
so that they could have an opportunity to issues that were not compliant, and then they reach out to you.
Yes.
And that's sort of what that US standards framework that we showed earlier, I think that was a result of what you're talking about. They threw 18F in there to make an accessible framework so that they didn't have to go back and fix all the government websites again in the end.
Mhm.
You guys mentioned a lot of accessibility tools in the beginning. What do you use to test the actual websites? Do you use just the screen reader or other things as well?
Everything.
You talk about what you use first.
Okay. So I like to use a combination of just looking at the markup and just scanning through. I'll use like developer tools in Chrome and just sort of work my way through visually on the regular website, looking at the markup, seeing what's up. Chrome or Google also offers a Chrome extension for accessibility, which is really helpful if you just want to do a quick automated check and again, just spit out a bunch of results that you can go back and check yourself. So sometimes I'll do that for things like color contrast. But a lot of it is just, at least on our side, just ruling manual, checking each thing and making sure it works.
Yeah.
And she uses a lot of
Yeah, and then I'll usually use some of the assistive technologies. So I'll use a screen reader to kind of follow up. So Tristan may have found that this is missing a label, so I kind of confirm that and see what happens with the screen reader. And the other thing is we just test with the keyboard. I mean, you can find so many issues with the keyboard because, as we mentioned, a lot of the assistive technologies are driven by the keyboard. So if you can't access something with the keyboard, the screen reader is not going to be able to access it, and speech recognition is not going to be able to access it. But yeah, sometimes we'll use a screen magnifier and speech recognition as well. And that usually kind of covers our bases. But really the best way, we are user researchers at heart. So the best way to do it is to do an accessibility or a usability test with people with disabilities who use those tools on a daily basis. That's really the best way to find accessibility issues.
You can imagine how hard it is to convince someone to let us spend all that money.
Yeah. Yeah, well.
So I know you guys do, well, but we're like aside from our like their panels of people that have disabilities that we go to, or
Yes, so a lot of times people will suggest like advocacy groups, sometimes like local libraries and or community centers, or just the local office for like the National Federation of the Blind. Usually they are they're very open to reaching out to their members or trying to find some people who are willing to test. And I think there are a couple resources, but I guess they're more like recruiting firms who will keep databases of people with disabilities who are interested in being usability test participants.
It's probably a good time to mention that UserWorks does have like dedicated recruiters, and
Yeah.
we sort of keep our own little database of these types of people as well. So.
I was just going to mention that I work for a government agency, and we recently did our first UX test using people with screen readers. And we actually had government employees who were handicapped in some way. And the interesting thing about the testing was that people using different screen readers had very different experiences. And success rate was much higher. So that was sort of something that we didn't really know or, anticipate.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so that's something you could only find if you were doing a usability test. You're not going to find, I'm not going to find that by me using screen reader the way I use it, even though I don't use it on a daily basis.
Yeah, because these were people with real vision impairments.
Exactly,
And
yeah.
a couple of them.
Yeah. Yes.
I recently encountered an issue with accessibility testing where I had certain results on using one browser with a screen reader, whereas with another browser, everything was coming out okay. How do you guys handle that situation? Do you just have to make sure it's accessible across the board for all the possible browsers, or what are your limitations?
Yeah, that is really unfortunate. And that is a problem that we have too. So typically, I mean, we just kind of have to do the best we can because we always like to say, I mean, you can't design for one particular screen reader or one particular browser because you never know what the user is going to be using. So you kind of just have to follow the best practices. Or like Tristan was saying, we can use the HTML5 and the ARIA just to kind of hopefully cover our bases. And then just keep advocating for the assistive technology companies and for the browsers to update and to kind of include all of this in their updates.
Yeah, so a lot of our recommendations will be like the lowest common denominator solution. So if you do this, it'll work across the board. You could do this and it'll work really well in Chrome, but it's just not going to happen in Explorer or something like that.
Yeah, but yeah, that is a really tough thing. Yep.
How do you determine how testing? Because of all the possible permutations of different ATs and different browsers and browser levels, and where do you draw the line and say, okay, we just can't test it anymore, it's just gotta go?
Yeah. Do you have an answer for that?
Big budgeted hours.
Yeah.
Most of the time. We try to find, we do a sweep and find all the really severe things.
Yeah.
And then if we have time left, we'll keep going back and checking and progressively getting into the minutia that's not as severe.
Yeah.
I think that's.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to find the big issues, and those are the most important ones. So then it's just kind of all those other smaller things that, as time allows, you kind of keep reiterating and rechecking. So, yeah. Yes.
Question. I was wondering, with like bigger data sets or data visuals, like get that 100 rows in an Excel sheet, how would you make that accessible? Like, you know, students that table, we do sort of that direct impact of the visual. And I guess for infographics too, like things that show sort of user path for like, I don't know, some complex infographics. I think that's really that.
Yeah, so I think the first one was a large table, like an extremely large table. Yeah.
Nationally representative.
Yeah. So if it's set up, if it's a simple table with column, like one column to one row, that can be completely accessible as long as you have column headers and, if appropriate, row headers, because then basically a screen reader user can be in this cell down here, and they can identify, they can know where they are by the column header and the row header. And so they can navigate a table pretty easily if it's just a simple table like that. So the size of tables isn't too bad. It's usually the complexity of tables, and that's where it gets more difficult.
And for those, I mean, they, people that have disabilities, I mean, obviously they can use Control F, and they can sort the columns and stuff. So making sure those controls are accessible is really important for huge data sets, to make sure that they can just sort it, find little things if they know what they're searching for. But yeah, if it's that large, it's, it's not even usable for someone who has vision, right?
Well, it's usually like the data visualization world is sort of show dot plot, 100 dots on the y-axis. Visually it would make sense to just look at it. But for a blind person, I imagine going through the roles, not meaningful.
Okay, so it might be more like of an alt text thing that you need. So a description of kind of what the plot looks like. And so in that case, we typically would just recommend a description of what that chart is showing. So is it showing some sort of trend? Is it showing more data on this end than that end? So, and sometimes, a lot of times if it's in a report or something, that's explained in the text already, because it's kind of discussing this. And so that's usually accessible as long as it's explaining what you're seeing in the in there. And it's the same with the infographics, like you were saying. Infographics can be notoriously inaccessible if that is the only place and the only way you have that information. But if you have that information in alt text or just describing it in the text, then that's accessible.
What Dana's describing is like totally the best way to do it right now, but there are some exciting things coming, like HTML5 Canvas isn't totally adopted by assistive technologies across the board yet, but they're starting to work that in. And so you can make these complex visualizations that can somehow communicate programmatically with the AT behind the scenes. And yeah, the support isn't there yet, but I think that's coming, and that's where that stuff's going to go. So instead of just alt text, you'll be able to really communicate.
Kind of going off that, if you have that information, you want to hide it, which ways do you usually, obviously there's ways for you to hide it, like throw it all the way to the left or whatever, make it like 0 pixels. What do you usually do?
So the 0 pixels thing is the thing we don't do. Or we try to, especially if it's interactive, definitely, because it'll be in the tab order at that point. They're just going to run into it and wonder what the hell they're looking at. But then there are things like ARIA hidden, which you could use if you wanted to use ARIA. Hidden is fine if you don't want it to be visually seen or in the tab order at all. There are like tricks you can use by taking interactive elements and throwing them off a page and then using tab index like -1 to remove it from the tab order and stuff like that. I don't know, what do you think is our most common recommendation for that kind of stuff?
Well, I think a lot of times I would say that there aren't too many situations where you do need to hide information. Because you almost want the same information to someone who has vision and someone who is blind. So ideally, they're both getting the same information. So like alt text is kind of the alternative to a graphic. So if you put it in the alt text, then it's kind of hidden that way. But if it's like a figure caption that's explaining the trend that you see in the graph or something, that can be useful both to a screen reader user as well as a sighted user. So we would probably argue for just having it visible. But yeah, if we do want to hide something, yeah, I think you mentioned he's the more techie person.
Just to make sure I'm understanding your question, are you talking about hide visually?
Infographic, right? Like I have like 40 different data points,
Uh-huh.
and basically an easier way to show it would be table, but I'm already showing it to a so I can see in a visual, like a picture, right? Like a JPEG instead of
Yeah.
a table. So just a way to show them this is the data points that we're showing. People can see it.
Right, and so it's not like duplicate information. That could be,
Yeah.
So definitely ARIA hidden is probably what we would recommend first because it's the compatibility is across the board most of the time.
It works across most browsers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say, back to my point, that that table actually could be useful to other people. So maybe people who have trouble reading graphs or something like that. So you could also just put a link to data table or something. And then anyone who wants to see that can go see it. So, yeah.
I have a question from the it's an interactive chart that shows stock prices over time.
Mhm.
So it's you hover over it and where you are in the chart, it'll tell you what the price is. But how do you explain that? How do you explain an interactive chart that is constantly moving and being moved out? How do you explain that? How much is enough information to make it accessible? You can have a chart that says this is the stock price from January to, and that's when we're looking at it here. What is it? They just have the whole chart. Like, we don't really know how much is enough.
Yeah. So I think we would kind of go back to that point of like, what does the user need to know? And then, so if it is just a summary thing, then maybe it's an alt text that kind of summarizes what it is. If it's, they need to know, they need to be able to access each different point, then maybe a table, and a table that goes along with it would be useful. If it's something that's changing, then that's one of the ways that you can use ARIA. It'll kind of, I think it's ARIA Live something. There are different versions of ARIA Live, and it'll kind of update and notify the user every time something changes. So there are a couple different ways depending on what the goal is of what the user needs to know. But yeah, it's done.
Sure. One more question, anybody?
That's all. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.